Yet another CyCon, we are talking about norms. So we have been talking about the norms, I think, the past 5 years. We have had specific workshops focusing on norms, specific panels, specific books. So this topic kind of keeps on giving. We are not exhausted from this topic, and hopefully you won't be exhausted either after this session. And I was very, very glad to see the setup for this session, because we have a very interesting mix of people. I would say you have this ideal setup. We have an international organization representative, we have a speaker from the government, and we have a speaker from academia. So we have very interesting different views, and it will be very nice to see how it plays out. And first, a couple of words on norms before we get to the first speaker. So I'm sure you're very well informed about the latest developments, and our speakers will give you a heads up. I would just want to point out that if we say norms, depending from our background, we may talk about different things. So for lawyers, we talk about international law norms which are legally binding. For example, you would have the initiative of Code of Conduct that was proposed by several states proposing a multilateral treaty on norms. However, in the UNGGE context, we would talk about politically binding, voluntary norms. And we will have several comments on the UNGGE process coming up from the speakers. And in addition to legally binding norms, politically binding norms, we today will also talk about domestic level norms and how to best harmonize these approaches between different states. So I'm looking forward to these discussions. We start off with Mr. Ben Hiller from Oecd, offering us a hopefully positive understanding on the way ahead regarding norms.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us to contribute to this session and to this topic. My name is Ben Hiller. I'm the OSCE Cybersecurity Officer, and the OSCE is not always well known what it is, but it is essentially the largest regional security organization spanning almost the entire Northern Hemisphere with 57 participating states. And we came into existence in the 70s as a platform for dialogue between East and West, and our founding documents, the Helsinki Final Act, which nowadays has some sort of revival given the security situation in Europe. Now, this session, as we heard, addresses cyber norms and where the debate is heading, and I'm very grateful for you to point out that when we talk about cyber norms, we often understand different things. I'm coming at it from an international policy perspective, for when I hear norms, I understand norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, so very much the interpretation the UN group of governmental experts put on it, and also the work of the UNGG and where it is heading. And I think we all agree that looking at recent developments at the UNGGE, we need some fresh thinking of where we are going and where this non-consensus has left us and what to do next. I think it's also fair to say that we are observing how international cyber policy dialogue has very much stalled. And I'm talking here about between non-like-minded states. Adversaries have or seem to have little confidence in international negotiations or international platforms, and little faith in finding constructive solutions at the moment. And what we witnessed, I think, at the GGE is that rather than promoting dialogue, we saw states digging in their heels and national positions hardening, often coming back to positions that are long held and focusing very much on scoring maybe points rather than engaging in good faith. But I think that's not surprising. I mean, given the current state of cyber affairs, it's very much reflective of the wider international political environment. Recent events are creating an environment of unease, defensiveness, and inwardness. And the question is how to move on from this paralysis. And I chose this title for a reason. It is a nod to Søren Kierkegaard, who is a Danish writer, social critic and religious author, and he introduced the concept of the qualitative leap of faith. Taking a leap of faith when a thought process constrains you so much that you are ultimately not able to carry out the planned activity, when you're too much dealing with processes rather than with outcome. And I believe this is exactly what is needed in the global norms debate and mechanisms that are associated, risk reduction mechanisms, to reduce the potential conflict stemming from the use of cyber capabilities. So the larger context matters when it comes to cyber policy negotiations. And maybe before we go into the nitty-gritty, just a reminder what is happening currently. And I would say we are living in an extraordinary time when it comes to international security. Clearly, the DNC hacks, without any doubt, had a major impact on pretty much any cyber-related activities since then. It set the discourse. The Ukraine conflict, something my organization is very much engaged with and trying to monitor, remains one of the most contentious issues in Europe. Russia's military exercise Zapad was a reminder that trust building does not work in an environment of constant provocation and expression of power. The refugee crisis and the Syrian war are a continuous challenge for citizens, diplomats, and military experts. And of course, China's island building activities in the South China Sea represents a significant geopolitical shift in the Pacific. And there's, of course, the Iran deal, Kim Jong-un's efforts to nuclear weapons, negotiations that are on and off and on and off. Both are contributing to an environment of little trust and confusion. And there are, of course, many, many more incidents and things that are happening. So clearly, we're living in a tense world, and relations between states are, at best, shaky at the moment. We're observing a global strategic shift, and no state has complete control over this process. And even states that are willing to engage diplomatically in good faith are having clear limitations, be it because of domestic politics or foreign policy limitations or overlapping strategic priorities, or quite simply because the counterpart is not willing to listen anymore. Overall, diplomacy can be messy, and it's sometimes quite astounding to see that we accomplished anything at all, especially also in the cyber policy domain. And I think this is something we cannot underestimate given current developments. And this is something I want to hold high, especially in a panel when we talk about norms and cybersecurity. Cyber diplomacy is very much tied to broader geopolitical trends, and we cannot understand the challenges at the UN or the OSCE, ARF, OAS without looking at what happened lately. Now, having spent so much time talking about non-cyber events, let us look at what happened on the UN level regarding cybersecurity. And this is not news to many of you, the UN GGE reports. Now, we all know that there was no consensus in 2017, so I will not delve into why this potentially was, because there's plenty of literature about it in the open. Instead, I want to talk about the components that were confirmed and were agreed on through the 2015 UN GGE report, because these components are still valid and should guide our behavior. Now, if you overly critical, a narrow look at the report might lead you to think that this document does not really add much to the international policy debate. But when you look at the agreement from a wider angle, it is actually quite impressive that states were able to chart a way forward in terms of global cyber stability by focusing on a four-pillar approach. And these four pillars, of course, is clarifying international law, norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, confidence-building measures, capacity building, and international cooperation. But I think what is important here is not to look at these four pillars in isolation. And this is something, unfortunately, which is often the case when it comes to international conferences. Norms alone and in itself will not create the sort of stable cyberspace we are all aiming for. And I sometimes feel that the other elements of the GGE reports are somewhat not considered in as much as norms. But clearly, it's important to implement all 4 components in tandem, because there's a reason there are 4 components. For instance, what happens if norms and rules are broken? This happens every day. You can have the best clarification on international law and how it applies. We know that states break it every day. What happens then? Well, then you need practical measures to address those digressions. You need the communication channels between states, between the right people, to either prevent escalation or to address the issue and to, I guess, punish the state that digresses. Now, this is where the CBMs come in. This is exactly the focus of practical confidence-building measures. But equally, if the state doesn't have the capacity to engage in responsible state behavior or to establish or implement practical measures to reduce potential tensions, then they cannot contribute to this process. So this is where capacity building is coming in. And that's the 3rd pillar. And again, all elements have to be implemented in tandem. But is this the case at the moment? I'm not too sure. For me, personally, currently there's a real appetite for norms. Be it proposals for new norms on the state level, norms for industry, norms regulating state and industry relations, norms for civil society, and it seems that there's a lot of push for norms and everyone is in the game. The positive side of this proliferation of the norms debate is that international cyber policy issues certainly have become mainstream. It's not anymore an issue just for the technical folks. It is a policy issue and all other sectors that are affected are thinking about it. So the multi-stakeholder approach and model is very much alive. But the key question is, do these discussions and processes make an impact on cyber stability between states? And what is the uptake by governments? And I'm looking at the norms debate from a cyber stability perspective. And the connected question is, what happened to the measures that were actually agreed at the UN and the Oecd and elsewhere? Are we making progress here, and are they being implemented? With regard to the first question, my personal view is that it is getting quite challenging, and I'm in enough negotiations between 57 states for policymakers to figure out key priorities within cyber diplomacy, given a lot of noise around the issue. I observe how they can become distracted by ever more catchy proposals, even though most of these proposals have little to no chance of ever getting sufficient governmental recognition on a global scale. With regard to the second question, I might hold also a very unpopular view, but I believe that the key emphasis at the moment, given the extraordinary times we're in, should be placed on implementing what has been agreed or clarifying what has been agreed. This means states should focus on implementing and on operationalizing agreed upon norms and CBMs and capacity building. They should use existing diplomatic fora to highlight when agreements are broken and develop a set of consequences in case of non-compliance of norms. Discussions, I believe, need to become more nuanced, streamlined, and channeled into the right structures. And I believe what the CCDOE is doing on the talent manual, but also a recent UNODA kind of guidance material in terms of clarifying international law or how to implement norms of responsible state behavior, is a very good demonstration of how this can be done. It helps states enormously to hear the view of academia and non-governmental experts on the thinking of those experts how these measures can be implemented. I think we should reflect on which norms, agreements, regulations are actually crucial for the maintenance of peace and stability among states at this very point in time. If a norm at hand does not fit to this description, maybe it is better at the time to put it on the back burner. And what I'm saying here is we need to be honest about what actually matters at this moment. Quality should be placed over quantity. Now, that leads me to the often cited challenge that we are trying to deal with a 21st century challenge through a 20th century framework and institutions. Absolutely, we are. I couldn't agree more. However, while for some issues such as international industry certification and multi-stakeholder approach makes a lot of sense, negotiations on international security affairs have taken place in intergovernmental fora for many decades, and for good reason. I understand that this is not appreciated by many, it is backward in some way, but it remains a fact on the ground that will not change anytime soon. We're not going to abolish these institutions that will continue being the prime fora for international security and peace. What I think instead is the key objective should be to parse out what the vast amount of topics within the cybersecurity umbrella and identify existing fora for each issue, who's doing what best and who should be dealing with the what. Global institutions like the UN or the OECD on the regional level, like-minded entities and fora that facilitate dialogue among non-like-minded states all have their value and need to look at their added value. And what we need to do is to maximize the effect and impact of existing platforms by using the right platform for the respective topic at hand. And I believe we are not making a too bad job of it. And this, I understand, goes very much against the general notion that everything is bad at the moment. I disagree. This also means that we need to keep in mind that there are windows of opportunities that come and go in cycles. This has always been the case, and it will continue to be the case. If at times negotiations are stalled in one particular forum, it can make sense to wait and pursue another pathway or another topic for a while, instead of pushing for a deal within a context that is not conducive to a meaningful outcome. Now, by matching topics with the right fora, one also needs to consider stakeholders. While for some issues, as I said before, private sector or civil society engagement is key, cyber stability negotiations between states might not benefit as much from this input. Now, let me be very clear. I do not mean to say that their input is not needed. But a significant amount of states will simply disagree that non-governmental stakeholders sit on the negotiation table. States' sovereignty is not gone in the age of the internet, and states will make sure that this message is understood whether we like it or not. And of course, this is not something the Western world is very keen on. I understand that, but I do not see that a state like Russia or China will change their tune anytime soon. In the end of the day, a related question is also whether we really have the time to spare to negotiate new all-inclusive institutions and platforms, given that we're already struggling to agree on norms, voluntary norms. Before we even get to finish what we have started, we simply do not have the luxury to ponder on processes and platforms in the light of increasing number of cyber incidents that threaten to impact on international peace and security. I believe now's the time to get on with implementing agreed measures and serious cyber stability negotiations in established formats. And this is a task, of course, that is already difficult enough given shifting priorities by states and blurred policy priorities in between them. I love this picture. Now, I rushed through a vast set of issues ranging from geopolitical tensions, strategic shifts, stalled international negotiations, etc., etc. The question is, how can states maneuver through all this without creating even more damage? The diminishing faith in international institutions, negotiations, and conflict prevention is a real concern for all of us. But the fact is, diplomacy has always been a marathon rather than a sprint. But in the end, the agreements that are brokered in Vienna, Geneva, New York, and Brussels, and elsewhere are designed to stay. They will shape how future generations of negotiators will frame an issue. Maybe even how a potential treaty on cybersecurity will look like in the very long term. But in order to get there, all states need to reconsider whether their international engagements can really be labeled as constructive. And I mean all states. Once you combine constructive engagement with a decent amount of good faith, the rate of diplomatic success, even if it's just on small scale, will pick up. And why do small achievements even matter at this point if we are at the brink of cyber war, as some claim we are? Well, we need to take the few islands of cooperation that do exist seriously and keep building from them. Progress and agreements might be small and look benign at the beginning, granted, but they do contain the potential for more sophisticated and complex agreements in the years to come. Now, from the OSCE perspective, this is why states are keen to operationalize those CBMs that have been agreed on by all 57, including Russia, the US, EU, and many Asian states. Because we believe that is the right way to address less contentious issues between states, and ultimately contribute to the establishment of mechanisms that create a certain routine and behavior between states. And what that means in practical, we're currently trying to set up a communications network for decision makers that can be used during cyber crises. And once in place, all 57 states will have the opportunity to pick up that red phone to call others to de-escalate potential tensions. Now, admittedly, after 2 days here, what I'm saying doesn't sound very exciting. I'm sorry. Kind of continue what we have started. No new big regimes, no new platforms, etc., etc. But the fact is, we need to build on those islands where the big cyberpowers have agreed on and need to build from there. And this will not be done by proposing a model that we ultimately know the other side will not accept, simply. Because the fact is, focusing on agreed measures will keep channels open and focus on practical cooperation and has the best chance to depoliticize the debate from which we can build on for more grander and bigger things later on. So this effort is not about reaching the same speed or level of technology developments. This is something that often is said, technology is outpacing what we can do in diplomacy and how we react. It's true, we will never catch up, and that's my personal view. But what we need to make sure is that the core pillars of state responsibilities are prepared for what's to come, be it artificial intelligence or even more connected world. We cannot win the race against technology, but we need to focus on the essential and build on islands that make sense. And that, ladies and gentlemen, requires a leap of faith, given the current political and international environment. And this is my call to do that leap of faith and to finish what has been started. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben, and I can really hear the first-hand experience in cyber diplomacy echoing back from your words. We will take all the presentations in a row, so keep your questions, write them down, don't forget them, and we'll then open the floor to questions after all three talks. So please, without further ado, Mr. Cedric Saba from Israeli Ministry of Justice, who will offer a different perspective on how to develop cyber norms. And also, sorry, who mentioned that we all look like cyborgs.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm not sure how different it's going to be. I found myself listening to Ben and agreeing with much of what he says, so I hope it's not going to be too redundant or repetitive for you guys. So being a lawyer, I of course need to start with a disclaimer, which is that the views I express here are completely my own and they don't reflect the views of my employer, the Israeli Ministry of Justice, or the Israeli government in general. Actually, I have several more disclaimers to make, but I'll raise these as I go along. So the subject of cyber norms has generated quite a bit of discussion in recent years, particularly after the publication of the UNGG report of 2015. Prominent academics, cybersecurity experts in the field, cybersecurity experts have discussed these issues at length, analyzing the ways in which existing norms could be implemented, new norms could be developed, which forums are appropriate to discuss which norms. And the sense of excitement and promise that existed after the 2015 report subsided somewhat in 2017, when it was reported that the Subsequent UNGGE did not reach a consensus. But despite this apparent setback, the topic of cyber norms is still very much on the international agenda. The question that I started with is, where are we headed with cyber norms? And it seemed to me, from multiple discussions that I was having, was that there exists a gap, as Ben pointed out, between, let's say, the initial excitement and promise of cyber norms and their actual implementation by states in practice. I believe that the potential pitfall in the current norms discussion is their overemphasis on global stability, norms that aspire to foster a peaceful, secure ICT environment. What I'd like to submit, and this is the focus of my presentation, is as follows. One, that in the current state of play, crafting norms with a goal of global stability as their primary focus might be somewhat ambitious. Two, a more modest objective might be within reach by paying greater attention to a different kind of discussion going on right now, namely international cooperation in the field of civilian cybersecurity. Things like information sharing between the public and private sector, software patching, regulation of cyber physical systems. And I argue that these types of discussions, which are already happening to varying degrees, can actually contribute to security in a pragmatic way. And three, the process matters just as much as the content. And the most promising way, I think, to forge norms that stick is not by positing the existence of a norm and then trying to implement them, but rather by empowering civilian cybersecurity officials and policymakers across the world, those who devise policy and also those who mitigate cyber incidents in real time, to engage with one another in a practical way. And only then can we begin to make out the contours of possible norms. So this is essentially a bottom-up approach. In this presentation, I'll elaborate on each of these 3 points. For the sake of good order, I'll adopt a very general definition of norms taken from a recent article by Duncan Hollis, shared expectations about appropriate or inappropriate behavior within a given community. So in the current state of play, what do we have? When reading the UNGGE report of 2015, and particularly the part about cyber norms, their intended focus on global stability really stands out. You have here just a few excerpts where the word stability, peaceful, comes up very often. Now, some of these norms, I would argue, are rather generic or abstract. For example, the norm that states cooperate with one another, the norm providing that states adopt good cybersecurity practices. However, other norms revolve around cyber operations. For example, the norm that prescribes states attacking another state's critical infrastructure or another state's CERT. We've heard about other norms being suggested after the 2015 GGE, such as the prohibition to manipulate financial data, which a reputable think tank advanced not too long ago, the prohibition to protect the core, not to attack the core elements of internet infrastructure, such as the domain name system. And if we expand the definition of norms a little bit further, we could also talk about norms aimed at interpreting how international law applies to cyberspace. For example, the attempt to define sovereignty in cyberspace, jurisdiction, the definition of use of force, armed attack, under the law of armed conflict, efforts at clarifying the rules of attribution. So to be sure, these are all fundamental questions, and they have very concrete implications for states. All these kinds of norms represent efforts, whether by states, or organizations, or academics, to make the world a safer place by clarifying the rules of the road, so to speak, setting red lines. And what these norms have in common, I think, is one, they're expressly designed to foster global stability, and two, they approach the core of national security, how a state operates in its defensive mission. These 2 points are related, of course. You can't talk about global stability without talking about how a state uses its power. However, this is also what makes cyber norms that deal with global stability challenging to implement in practice. Norms on global stability, as Ben pointed out, invariably involve complex issues of international relations, geopolitics, national defense, and international trade. There are also fundamentally different conceptions about information communication technologies, what the role of government with respect to ICTs should be. This has been one of the enduring questions since John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, and what this means for how international law applies to ICTs. For example, we heard last week from the UK Attorney General, who in a landmark speech seemed to be suggesting, I think he was saying it quite clearly, that sovereignty is not a legal rule, echoing the writings of Gary Korn from US Cyber Command. I don't want to open up this particular debate, but it's illustrative of the real conceptual challenges that countries are still grappling with, which make it difficult for states to achieve a real, meaningful common understanding on these big questions, at least at this point in time. States are going about this incrementally, very carefully, and rather slowly. Another challenge is the technological one. Now, it's redundant to say that technology is evolving rapidly, and I don't think that this should be an excuse to not try to understand how law applies to existing technology, but we must still be aware that the challenge posed by evolving technology is real. Aside from the current difficulty in categorizing existing technologies and grappling with existing issues like security for the Internet of Things and on the cloud, we have emerging tech such as AI, quantum computing, which could be real game changers. And states are understandably reluctant to move too quickly on norms, or law for that matter, in those circumstances. So how do we go about forging cyber norms in these limitations? Well, in the 2015 GGE, we saw norms that were abstract and that are drafted in a constructively ambiguous manner. Sorry. For example, the norm about protecting the integrity of the supply chain. And we also saw norms that are more specific, but also more aspirational. For example, the norm not to attack critical infrastructure. And that results in norms existing on paper, but not really achieving their purpose of influencing state practice. So allow me to make my second disclaimer here, and which is that all this is not meant at all as a criticism of the 2015 GGE or norms-making efforts in general. And I don't see the lack of consensus in the 2017 GGE as a failure either, nor do I mean to suggest that we shouldn't be trying to achieve global stability. The 2015 GGE achieved something very meaningful. It contributed to the international conversation. We saw it endorsed by the GA, the G7, G20. And the idea of conceptualizing something as a cyber norm, as a norm, rather than international law, provides a certain flexibility to states, and also a way for states to agree about something without having to commit in a firm way. So without being naive about it, the drive towards peace and stability should always inform our course of action. But 3 years later, I think the international community can and should assess where we are at this stage and whether continuing on the exact same trajectory is bearing the expected fruit. In my view, if we stay overly focused on crafting global stability type norms, we might lose out on another opportunity that is ripe for further developments, and that's in the field of civilian cybersecurity. So I'll define here cybersecurity in a rather narrow sense. The policies and actions taken by a state to protect its computers and its networks, its critical infrastructure, and also the computers and networks of organizations within its jurisdiction, and mitigate attacks on a technical level. I'm influenced here by the setup we have in Israel, where we have the Cyber Directorate, which is a sole-purpose agency that is separate from the defense forces and other security agencies, and it has a basic mission, which is acting through regulation, law, policies. It operates in a highly transparent manner in cooperation with the public and private sector organizations. And all this is in order to promote basic robustness of organizations, because ultimately the cyber battlefield is in their networks. These organizations are the first line of defense. Other countries have taken their own approach, and we have CERT in the US and the EU, and I think we can confidently assert that at this stage, cybersecurity has evolved and matured into its own discipline. The issues that cybersecurity officials across the world are facing are diverse, and often they're more technical and specific than these big picture, global stability, world peace issues that most cyber norms efforts thus far have dealt with. For example, the challenges of information sharing between the public and private sectors, fostering trust between stakeholders, what should be the role of the state and the appropriate level involvement in this ecosystem? How does a CERT collecting information on a cyber incident address privacy concerns? How can a government ensure that its data that is stored on the cloud in servers located abroad remains secure? breach incident reporting requirements, bug bounty programs for the public and private sector, active defense for private sector organizations, best practices for governments and organizations. And this is before we get into more industry-specific cybersecurity questions, such as in the field of energy, banking, securities, etc. So these are all represent actual, concrete policy questions and challenges that cyber policy makers across the world are facing or will be facing in the near future. While each of these topics is important domestically, not each of them warrants necessarily a big international discussion. And in some cases, there are already discussions going on. But some of them might be ripe for some internationalization, so to speak. For example, and I'm not suggesting this as a specific norm, but the question of anonymization of data, when data is collected for analysis by the cybersecurity agency, how do we ensure that it remains anonymous and that no privacy breach occurs? And so here we have a space for a robust discussion between cybersecurity officials and privacy experts. Now, all of these four topics are indeed part of national security. They're not global stability issues. When civilian cybersecurity officials discuss these topics, for the most part, they're not trying to solve world peace. Their discussions tend to be focused on more discrete policy questions. Taken together, they can contribute to making the world more safe and secure, which is consistent with the ultimate goal of cyber norm activists, but it's not expressly placing global stability as the ultimate goal. Now, I acknowledge that there's no clear demarcation line between global stability and civilian cybersecurity. I think you can imagine these along a spectrum, but some of these are clearly more closely related to global stability, and others are closer to the civilian cybersecurity side. So the next step in the analysis is to look into the ways in which the focus on cybersecurity topics could fit within the cyber norms discussion. So, as I mentioned, cybersecurity officials are already having discussions on certain issues. First, the network of certs is discussing a lot of these things. We've seen the OECD tackle some aspects of cybersecurity, such as best practices for governments and organizations for cybersecurity risk management. There are increasingly bilateral agreements at different levels of government. UNTITRAL, the UN Commission on International Trade Law, has begun to address cloud computing contracts, including for government procurement. Several bodies are discussing standards for IoT. So these discussions are happening in different ways. At the same time, I think what's missing here is two things. One is that the technical bottom-up discussion that I'm referring to seems to be disconnected from the global cyber norm efforts. And two is that there are many other issues, some of which have been addressed by some really fascinating policy papers that have not yet graduated to the level of international discussions. For example, privacy and cybersecurity, active defense in the private sector, software labeling. So to think about moving the discussion forward, I think it's useful to look at some case studies. One is the norm prohibiting cyber theft, industrial cyber theft. It didn't make its way into the GGE, but it did end up in the US-China agreement of 2015. It was replicated by Canada. So this, to me, suggests that this bilateral approach stemming from specific concrete problems that a country is facing has promise for future norm-making efforts. They weren't attempting to solve world peace, just dealing with a domestic issue. Most reports suggest that this norm was largely successful in curbing industrial cyber theft. And if these reports are accurate, this would suggest that this type of an approach can work in practice in other cases as well. Another example is the Cybercrime Budapest Convention. It's not a norm, but a full-fledged treaty. And here, it wasn't just a bottom-up approach based on the needs of the police and prosecution officials, but also it required some top-down help from at the capital level. We've heard yesterday, I think, discussions about another possible US-EU agreement on sharing data for law enforcement purposes, the extension of the Microsoft case. Another example is at the most recent IGF, there were at least two interesting panels that dealt with this type of issue. One was about cert diplomacy and looking into how certs can take a greater role in the international conversation. Another one that I was involved with from afar, so full disclosure, dealt with how we could leverage the multi-stakeholder model for domestic cybersecurity policymaking. And one interesting point that emerged from that last panel was how the NIST framework, which was developed by the NTIA, is being used and implemented by other countries. So here, it's not a norm, but it's a best practice document that is actually having an impact outside of its borders. So what conclusion do we reach from these case studies? I think it's that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Every topic requires its own approach. One thing is clear, to me at least, is that the focus shouldn't be necessarily on more forums, more norms. Norms shouldn't be forced or declared into existence in the abstract. Rather, they should be allowed to emerge organically, bottom up, based on actual needs and challenges faced by civilian cybersecurity officials. In some cases, the end result might not be cyber norms per se, but shared understandings, a shared taxonomy, best practices, guidelines. The agreements might be bilateral, multilateral, they might be between like-minded countries only, or something more global. The point is that instead of trying to define the agenda in advance, it would be more useful at this stage to empower and expand upon the discussions happening between cybersecurity officials. One last point, I started with a disclaimer, and I'll end with one. This is not at all intended to deny the role of cyber diplomacy. On the contrary, cyber diplomacy is crucial here because sometimes pure technical discussions between cybersecurity officials will not be enough. In order for the process to move forward, you need the support from the push from the top down that complements this bottom-up approach. The Budapest Convention and the US-China Agreement on cyber theft, I think, are examples of that. In short, I think there are different bilateral and multilateral models that could be explored depending on the circumstances and the needs of cybersecurity officials. And if we can shift the focus of the discussion on cyber norms to pay greater attention to those needs, we could be contributing to cybersecurity in a very concrete way. Thanks again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for the interesting perspective on the bottom-up approach and why we need to take into account all these different new ideas as well on the diplomatic and state level. Next up will be Professor Jeff Kosov from US Naval Academy, and who will be introducing the idea of putting more focus on developing domestic laws.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And to follow up with Cedric, I have some disclaimers of my own. I should have this memorized by now. The views that I expressed today are only my own and don't represent the U.S. Naval Academy, the Department of Navy, or the U.S. Department of Defense, or anyone else. As you hear what I'm going to say, you'll see why that's particularly important, because I usually say something that people strongly disagree with. But what's really important here, and this really is following up a lot on what Cedric said. I just met him yesterday, but it seems like we have been thinking about this problem quite on the same wavelength. And that is the discussions that we've been having for a long time now about applying international law to cyber, everything from due diligence to self-defense, proportionality, those are key. One thing that I think has been missing from a lot of the international discussions has been domestic civilian cybersecurity law and how different nations can work together to harmonize, improve, and collaborate on those issues. And I think it's more important than ever because when you look at, and this gets to Bruce Schneider's keynote earlier today, we've got to be doing a better job defending our systems, defending our networks, and I think law does play a crucial role here. What I first want to do is, before I talk about where we can improve cybersecurity law, I want to define cybersecurity law for the purposes of this presentation, which is a tough task. I published a textbook creatively titled Cybersecurity Law last year, and I sent in my draft, and the publisher had some comments, and one of them was, what is cybersecurity law? You might want to define that in the introduction. And so that actually took me a while, because there's a lot of different conceptions of cybersecurity law. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm defining cybersecurity law as laws domestically that seek to promote the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of public and private computer systems, networks, and information. So again, there are many different definitions of this. but that's basically what I'm going with in terms of what we might want to improve upon. And I've been at the Naval Academy for 3 years now, and when I got to the Naval Academy, I got a lot of messages, email messages that said BLUF at the beginning. Some of my Naval Academy colleagues are here today. I had no idea what that meant because I've been a civilian all my life. I asked someone, and that's a bottom line up front. So what my bottom line up front, which I appreciate that phrase now, is that our legal system, both domestically, internationally, does not do a very good job addressing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems, information, and networks. And as Bruce Schneider had alluded to earlier, just sort of in terms of practice, we do focus on confidentiality quite a bit. The C, everyone knows the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Our laws do focus on protecting the confidentiality, and part of that has to do with the fact that some of our earliest threats were data breaches. It's an outgrowth of data security laws, an outgrowth of privacy law, which has been in existence for a while. But what we need to start doing is addressing integrity, making sure that connected devices operate as planned, availability, preventing ransomware attacks that shut down hospitals for weeks upon weeks, preventing people from getting critical care. And that's what we need to be having an international dialogue about that. But that's not necessarily bad news, the fact that we don't have sufficient laws on the books, because that means that we have a huge opportunity here to work together and come up with laws that are effective and efficient and actually accomplish the goals of shoring up the defenses of both the public and private sector. Now, you might wonder, why would country A care about the domestic cybersecurity laws of country B? And I won't go into too much detail, but I would say that WannaCry, Mirai, those are examples where there have been attacks on one country that have spread and impacted other countries. So there's really a pragmatic reason for countries working together to overall improve the cybersecurity and reduce the harm of attacks that happen. Now, there are benefits. As I said, bolstering cybersecurity in one country can help with another country. Now, to be clear, there's no such thing as perfect cybersecurity, but it's at least getting toward a point where the defenses are stronger and it benefits multiple countries. It helps with deterrence by denial, for example, making it harder for the adversaries to accomplish their goals. But it's also more than that. A lot of the infrastructure that is subject to the attacks, when you think about the major attacks that we've been suffering, often are the private sector. So having a consistent set of values that set the framework for all of the laws that govern these companies helps increase the likelihood that they're actually going to be able to comply, and it gives them clear guidance here. Now, I've got to pause for a second and talk about the elephant in the room, which is GDPR, which is along these lines. Now, I'm going to put on my obnoxious American hat just for a minute. I promise I won't be, and just say that from a US perspective, on the data protection side, for some companies, it has not gone so smoothly, and I'm not laying blame on either side. I think that there have been 2 years in which US companies could have complied, but what I think is part of the problem here is that there's a core set of values that are somewhat different between Europe and the United States when it comes to privacy and free expression, especially when it comes to things like the right to be forgotten. And we have this regulation that has a fairly broad territorial jurisdiction, and that's caused some problems. From Estonia, tried to get onto the 5th largest newspaper's website in the United States, the LA Times, and I encourage anyone who's not on a VPN, which we really should be on anyway, but I encourage any of you to go onto the website of the LA Times from here, and you'll see a message basically saying it's not available because of the GDPR. That's not an ideal outcome, and I think, again, there perhaps was not sufficient dialogue about these shared values between the various jurisdictions for data protection, And that's part of the problem that we're facing now. I think we don't want to face that with cybersecurity as we have jurisdictions rolling out more comprehensive cybersecurity laws and directives. So again, I think this is a great opportunity to have these discussions. And I think that there are some models that provide us with significant hope that we can do this. As Cedric had mentioned, the Budapest Convention. Just setting these basic frameworks, these bare minimums for cybercrime statutes, such as unauthorized access to a computer. That's very helpful, and that's helped at least establish a common ground among the participating nations. I would be remiss to not mention the Tallinn Manual, which has done a remarkable job incorporating various points of views. When I assign the Tallinn Manual in my classes, I tell the students, please don't just read the bold print, read the commentary, read what the minority views are. That's the type of discussion that we should be having also about other cybersecurity laws, domestic data security laws. And then finally, going back a little bit, when you look at the OECD guidelines for privacy, which are decades old, when you look at some of the principles that they laid out, like purpose limitation, those are in pretty much every privacy law that you can see in the world. I think that is probably the closest to a model of what we want to be doing for cybersecurity laws. So again, I think that there is tremendous hope. I want to spend the rest of my time just briefly talking about the goals for these principles that underlie cybersecurity law. And it would be modernization, uniformity, coordinating the regulations and the incentives, and then securing the supply chain. So modernizing, I talked about the CIA triad. Again, focusing on how do we promote integrity, how do we promote availability, how do we prevent ransomware from shutting down operations. So basically figuring out what works well, having this discussion. Uniformity of regulations, I don't know if anyone here works in a corporate cybersecurity department, but if you do, if you suspect that there's been some sort of cybersecurity incident, a data breach, I hope the first person that you call is your lawyer. I've worked on dozens of data breaches and other incidents for large companies from private practice, and I can tell you there's a lot of responsibilities that the clock starts ticking on immediately in terms of notification. For the US, just within the US, companies face data breach notification laws in 50 different states and the District of Columbia. And each one of those is a little different. They get triggered by different types of information. They have different form requirements. In Massachusetts, it's illegal to describe the data breach, what happened. In other states, you're required to. And I can tell you, I've seen it large companies and small companies and everything in between, that for the first few days after a data breach, what you have is everyone from the CEO to the CISO, all the way down to the line staff, figuring out how do we draft these breach notifications in these 50 states, and then you add on the other countries. And you've got to wonder, is that accomplishing our goals of remediating the damage, preventing further harm, preventing another breach? And I can say from personal experience, it doesn't. What I would love to see are some guiding principles that help to start standardizing these requirements so there's not so much confusion. And so that it's a more seamless process where people, regulators, individuals are notified in a timely manner, but it's something that does not require a team of lawyers and experts to figure out if you're using the right font and all of the other particulars. Another issue that I think could be dealt with on the international stage is coordinating what would be coercive and cooperative cybersecurity laws. Now, I personally, for a lot of areas of regulation, believe that strong regulations are necessary because the goals of companies simply are not aligned with the interests of the general public. I would say the environment is one of them, because companies by definition are trying to look out for their shareholders, and oftentimes for things like the environment, that's not going to be aligned. I think there's more of an opportunity for an alignment of the goals of the public and companies for cybersecurity. Because if you're a rational CEO, you're not going to say, I'd love to have a data breach. This seems like a great way to start the day, because that's going to harm your bottom line. Now, of course, CEOs typically think in 3-month increments because that's when they have to report their quarterly earnings, so they might not necessarily make long-term investments. But there's at least an opportunity to have more cooperative cybersecurity laws rather than just saying, we're going to fine you if you have a data breach. What we want to do is prevent the data breach from happening in the first place. And I think if we had a global framework, or at least some sort of set of values of how to have these sort of cooperative programs like information sharing, education and workforce development, and dare I say tax incentives, tax credits for investments in cybersecurity, I think that would go a long way toward making sure there are some synergies and ultimately having the goal of preventing significant damage from data breaches and other cybersecurity incidents. And then finally, securing throughout the supply chain. I know there was, during the workshop, there was a session on this. I think particularly for setting these international values, the supply chain is very important because it's going to be pretty rare that you have products and services that rely on components that are entirely from one country. So having these values, these principles that secure the supply chain globally will help ultimately meet this goal. Now, in conclusion, I want to just stress again, I'm not looking to pass some sort of model law or one single law across nations. That would be impossible, both for substantive and procedural reasons. I think what we could do is have this set of values or principles that would come after significant discussion among nations as to what is the most effective. Sharing experiences, figuring out what information sharing programs work, what don't work, what education programs work or don't work. And the reason why we have so much opportunity is because, frankly, our legal systems are not addressing these things right now. So I would rather see us have these significant, substantial discussions at the outset rather than everyone going their own way and then figuring out how to reconcile the different laws afterward. And with that, I take questions.
Thank you very much for Professor Jeff Kossoff. Can we have the time left for the discussion here at our dear clock, please? So let's start off with the discussion. Before we give the floor to you, I'll begin with a couple of questions on my own. Perhaps I will begin with your presentation since it was the last. Thank you for an interesting account on which domestic level focal points we should have. You mentioned that we should focus on a set of core values, and then hopefully as a wider goal, we should harmonize them as much as possible. How do you think we could, with the goal of harmonizing these values, how do you think we could avoid the pitfalls that we saw happening in the UNGG process, especially in 2017, which was claimed, at least in media, as an end of an era or a dead end for the UNGG. So how to avoid that?
Yeah, I would defer to Ben particularly for any sort of lessons learned from that process. But I would say that I think the issues that I'm discussing might perhaps be a little less politically loaded. I think there's definitely going to be some significant business interests involved. So I think it would be a very different set of issues. But I think starting very general and having very high level values, such as if law enforcement asks for you to delay a breach notification for their own investigation, do you do that? So there's one set of standards and you're not getting in trouble in various jurisdictions. I'm not saying it's going to be easy or even successful, and particularly after the GGE, but I think there's at least some opportunity to make that attempt.
Yes, because, for example, the example you brought from criminal procedure, these are issues that are attempted to be dealt with in the Budapest Convention, but as we know, for example, Russia has not signed the document, so again, you have an option or a platform for further discussion, but again, we have sides who do not agree.
Oh yeah, I mean, with when you don't have Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran signed up to a cybercrime statute, there's limited efficacy. I would definitely take that point.
Do you have any comments on this issue? So how to get others or not like-minded states on board?
Well, I said how to get non-like-minded states. I mean, there has been agreement at the 2015 and was noted at the General Assembly, the reports. So there are documents that have been agreed by all of them, and we need to identify and move on those topics where we can see that we can move on, and that essentially was one of the challenges of the last GGE, that especially with the international law section, that we saw that two sides came from quite different positions, and that was a matter of principle rather than of engaging good faith. I commend you, because I think it's going to be quite a challenging process, to be honest, in the current environment. I also would caution that we need to be mindful not to mix up topics. And I think a lot of what you talked about really falls in the purview of cybercrime issues and kind of dual criminality, law enforcement cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what the GG is dealing with is a very particular topic, cyber stability, or how to promote peace and stability in the face of states using cyber capabilities. And I think these are different sets that might not be helpful to mix them up as such.
Any comment on this? Because it was mentioned global stability, which is one of your key ideas to go on the other direction.
So as I said before, I'm not against global stability or trying to foster global stability, but I think the common thread between the three of us is that it's being aware of the inherent limitations of these big processes and the reality. So if we're aware of these inherent limitations, the way forward is maybe a little bit more clear than otherwise.
Because it seems to me that the way forward is not that clear at all. Like currently, we have you who proposed that we should use the existing platforms, the already existing agreements. You're mentioning the UNGG 2015 report, the CBMs. You mentioning the bottom-up approach, the civil cybersecurity approach, and then we have the domestic kind of direction. So we have very different ideas. If you would have to point out, what do you think would be the next step, next concrete step that is hopefully more successful? But I need to add that one of you made a point that it was not a failure, the UNGG 2017. It's rather let's say, an honest reflection of the current state of affairs. But still, nevertheless, what do you think is the next step in these discussions?
I would say all of the above. I think that there's an urgency here that, so I think attempting on all three fronts would be, and I know that's easier said than done, and I'm an academic, so I can say that, but that would be my preference. I don't think it's an either-or situation.
Again, I think all of our three things are connected. For example, a lot of the CBMs deal with, I think, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but it's things that in practice would be implemented by national certs. And so, for example, if there's a breach in one country, who's picking up the phone at the first line of defense, the immediate case could I think, conceivably be the cert on the other end, simply to mitigate the attack. Now for this, you need domestic cybersecurity laws and policies that regulate the process, automate the process, systemize the process. So all of these things are connected. I don't think it's necessarily either or.
Ben, any comments?
I would agree with that. I mean, as I said before, we're looking at different issues here. So it's hard to say, okay, this is the way forward, because each area has, their own sets of challenges, and we need to be very mindful of that. I'm looking at it from a global perspective, from a policy perspective. You look at the legal perspective from a national point of view, and you look at it from, what can be done, what are the priorities on the national level, and how can they be spun up to the global level as a kind of common challenge. Where do we move from here? I think, as I said, we need to focus on where consensus has been achieved. And these are then islands of cooperation that we can build on. All processes have their value with different degrees of challenges and difficulties along the road. But I think what we need most of us now, what we need most is at the moment is a certain degree of realism, what is achievable and not. That to a large degree depends on international environment that is not very conducive to make progress in the field that already is so contentious. So I think we need to also have some patience and
so take a deep breath then.
Take a deep breath. Yeah.
A question to you about CBMs. You mentioned that there is a lack of overview of how states are implementing them. Or is there a detailed report on which states are really following them on all accounts, which states are not?
I mean, first, to answer the question, all the CBMs are voluntary, like the norms are voluntary. It's built on the assumption that it's in every state's interest to be a good cyber neighbor, if you want, that you don't want to be singled out to be the odd one out or to be the one that is somehow compromising the cyber environment. So the idea here is that you create some peer pressure and that you display all these behaviors for the own good, if you want. So with the CBMs being voluntary, measuring how they implement it is somewhat difficult. Also because you need to understand that some of them they focus on very different issues. Some of them are an exclamation of goodwill. Some of them are actually quite detailed and kind of producing procedures on reducing risks of conflict stemming from the use of cyber. And some are really homework tasks, what states should do in order to be good cyber neighbors, to kind of promote national resilience of systems, to kind of harden all software and hardware and be not the weakest link in that community. So implementation is key, and what we are doing is to look at what can be done to promote implementation of these measures. And we're doing that because we feel that in essence, they're quite practical. In essence, we're talking about quite benign things on paper. Talking about establishing secure communication lines between decision makers who ultimately are taking decisions if there's a big enough cyber incident that could threaten bilateral relations. Now, that's in the interest of every state. There's nothing political about it. And even though this is harder than we thought, because, of course, in the end of the day, you need to make a decision whether you want to pick up the phone, whether you want to be reached or not. Maybe it's quite interesting to continue using these capabilities. So we're grappling with that question more than anything, that yes, everyone agrees. In principle, that's a good idea, but how are we implementing them exactly, and how far-reaching are the consequences of implementation of these measures?
We do know from mutual legal assistance process that if you do not want to respond and cooperate with the other side, you always find a reason not to do that. Do we have questions from the floor? Yes, please. First hand I saw here. Oh, great. So many questions. Gentlemen, yes, you, please. Oh. Actually meant the other guy, but but then you're next.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Dennis Broeders. I'm from Leiden University. This has been an interesting range of thoughts, and I like the idea of sort of starting from the limitations and realities. I have a question for all three of you, actually. Starting with Mr. Hiller, you sort of referenced CBMs, and then you said, it was probably a slip of the tongue, but you said punishment as well. which was interesting. Yeah, he did. And it was interesting because Chris Painter, who is now no longer a diplomat, so he speaks a little more freely, has been speaking on a number of occasions about the fact, are we not actually creating a bottom-up norm of inaction? Because all these things happen, they're in violation of some of the norms we have agreed upon, but we're not really doing anything. So that is more sort of like a state practice. Do we also need a state practice to deal with the state practice of violating of norms? So that's one for you. Mr. Saba, I like the idea of a civil approach, a civil cybersecurity approach. But to a certain extent, we're now in the landscape where industry is actually being sucked into the national security debate because everything happens on their infrastructure. They are the ones who have to deal with the fallout of everything. So they're actually engaging with the national security debate to a certain extent because they feel they have to. So how viable is it to sort of retreat to a civil layer? And for some actors, you referenced CERT diplomacy. I think a lot of CERTs would rather stay out of diplomacy and stay in the tech layer. So that's another one. And the last one is for Mr. Kosseff. You talked about cybersecurity is an issue where there's actually much more alignment between government interest and private interest. I'm not so sure, because what we see a lot is people talk about public-private cooperation or even public-private partnerships, and it's all very rosy, it's all very nice, everybody likes each other. But security as a collective thing, collective security, is very different from what a company would consider security at a level that is fine for them, but does not necessarily add up to what a government would like to see, even when you add up the pieces. So maybe a reaction on that.
Yeah, what I would say about that is, I think the alignment is for the ends for the particular organization. I take your point and I agree with it that collective cybersecurity perhaps is not going to necessarily be in the best interest, particularly of a company that is very focused on the next earnings statement. They might not realize that collective cybersecurity in the long run will actually help the company overall. So I completely agree. The means are, there's not necessarily an alignment on the means, but in terms of the goal of reducing the likelihood of a devastating attack on that company, there's somewhat more of an alignment. I think it's the challenge for policymakers is explaining how their suggested means of getting toward that end benefits the company as well. And I think that's what's easier than in other regulated areas.
Regarding your question, your first question about the involvement of companies, it's true. Whether they like it or not, they're part of the national security discussion. But in a way, in the model that I'm proposing, this is no different than almost any other issue that I can think of. For example, environmental law or health law, the field of health policy making, where you have a state that first tries to look at what's happening inside, so it will consult with its internal organizations dealing with this. So if it's in the field of health, the state will consult with its health providers and the medical association, the pharmaceutical industry, etc. And then from this will formulate a position that it takes abroad based on its own needs. So I think that's okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. And regarding CERT diplomacy, I concede your point. First, we should bear in mind that some CERTs are, there's CERTs of different compositions. Some CERTs are composed of private actors, and some CERTs are purely national CERTs. So I'm not trying to define in advance which should be, who should do what. But let's say if the starting point is a national CERT, then here too, and I think the discussions in the last IGF were really interesting and useful to look at what could be the role, but it could start with what a national CERT, what its needs are concretely, how could it implement its mission better, and then from there, what voice does it want to have, and maybe other CERTs think the same way, and that could be the basis for discussions. This is kind of what I have in mind when I say CERT diplomacy.
I'm kind of regretting my word, using the word punishment. Maybe that was a bit...
Now it's too late, it's too late.
Maybe a bit strong, even, yeah, anyway. But I agree. I mean, you know, what we do need is some sort of consensus, or at least among a group of states, what are the red lines, and if those red lines are crossed, what is a response? And that's certainly, I see, a task for NATO here, quite frankly. What happens then? A difficult job, because it's always, in the end of the day, of course, a sovereign decision how you react to an adversary, and I don't see that states will be too happy to not have that authority. With regard to CBMs, I think we need to see it as a step before that. Now, both the norms and CBMs have been conceived, I believe, with the idea that states are interested in being a positive contributor to cyberspace rather than an evildoer. So if you start from that premise, then you would think that it's in everyone's interest to resolve issues. Now, anyway, that's how these norms and CBMs are conceived, including our CBM number 3, which is in essence a consultation mechanism between states if there's a big cyber incident and you have an interest of calling a counterpart in another country and say, look, this is coming from your territory, this is how it looks to us. I mean, is it you, is it someone else? If it's not you, can you deal with this? Because that's part of your responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an engagement in good faith. If that doesn't fail, then what is there? And this is, of course, something, yes, absolutely, that we need to address, and at the moment we do not have answers to that.
Right, thank you very much. We're out of time. Can we take one more question? Yes, the gentleman who almost had the microphone.
Hello?
So this will be the last question then.
Okay, just one reflection. I don't think my name is Anders Kalin, I'm from the Swedish MFA. I don't think there is a contradiction between all the efforts on sort of the national level, civil cyber security, and what's going on in the foreign and security, global stability. These two sort of areas are mutually reinforcing. So there's no contradiction, at least not from the Swedish point of view. I just have one question for Ben, because I know we're short of time. So I was going to make a long intervention, but I realized that this is not the time. But one question with regard to confidence building measures. If you would pick one confidence building measure, you know the OECD ones, and maybe also looking at the GG report, what would that be, which is also realistic?
Thank you for the question. And let me clarify, I didn't mean to say that all these processes don't have value. I looked at it from a very narrow angle, which is cyber stability between states on the global scale, including all the cyber powers and how they feel about all of these initiatives. So my point was that we need to look at all of these states and see where are commonalities and what are the islands of cooperation that we can move on. That's not to say that all these initiatives that are happening are not contributing to informing positions of one group of states, and that's good. So it was a very narrow focus. With regard to the CBMs, I think the key CBM is, for me, the crisis communication mechanism, and that is also realistic. As I said, being able to communicate in an event of a crisis is in the interest of every state. Because I don't think any state really is interested in letting this escalate to a degree where they can't step away from this anymore. And this is something that we repeatedly hear that from states, that this is in all their interests and there should be nothing political about this, to be able to communicate on the high policy level if there's something happening. And again, I would also say that this kind of communication between decision makers happens in parallel to existing channels. So it wouldn't replace third-to-third communication, And I would agree with the gentleman there that CERT to CERT maybe should not engage in diplomacy. They have already established good relations with most other of their counterparts, and maybe that would endanger that sort of relation that they already established and that we are absolutely in need of, and need as a fallback option.
I apologize. One more last quick comment.
Thank you very much. I'm Laura Fresco from the Swiss MFA, and I know that we are running out of time, so let me just make one quick comment regarding the way forward. I think what the UNGG did, and I'm really against this negative narrative of failure or the end of an area, because I really think that the UNGG process culminated into 3 very important reports that published or that agreed on a set of rules, and I think this is the basis, the starting point to move forward. But what it did, it left us with a void, because we don't have a platform. We lack a platform for states to continue the international cybersecurity dialogue on ICT and in the context of stability and peace. So Switzerland, Germany, and Mexico, they proposed an initiative which I believe could be a leap of faith, and I'm happy to discuss this proposal a little bit further during the coffee break. And we have also developed a non-paper. I'm happy to distribute it. I would have liked to outline this, but I think because we're running out of time, I think we can do that bilaterally. So approach me if you're interested in this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I do hope that we meet again next year, again with norms, and then we'll see if the leap of faith really paid off. So thank you. Thank you.